Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how to make your Zoom meetings more secure. You've probably heard about this, what people are calling Zoom bombing, which is essentially just unwanted guests in your Zoom meeting. And so we're going to talk about how to lock your meetings down a little bit and some of the options that you have. I want to begin with your personal meeting room. Everyone has a personal meeting room. And in your personal meeting room, we can do a couple of things. First of all, every personal meeting room has an assigned number, and that number oftentimes will get used over and over again. And so the potential is for people to have that number and possibly to try to enter that when there's a meeting going on. You have the ability to modify that number if you choose. So if you've been publicizing that for people to see, you might say, well, and especially if they actually have joined your meeting, you can change that. So just go up to personal meeting ID, and here you can change that. It's a 10-digit number, and then people who had the number before would no longer be able to find it. So you would have to send it out again to those you want to be in the meeting. Second thing you could do is you could require a meeting password. I wouldn't do this for my meetings because I tend to use them kind of on the fly. Instant meetings is the way I use them, so I don't use that, but you could do that. The participants video is turned off initially when someone joins. I do the same thing with muting participants upon entry. I do like for people to be able to get into the meeting before I join, just because sometimes people aren't sure how it works and they want to test it out. I think one of the best things you can do with your personal meeting room is to turn on the Enable Waiting Room feature. That means that before they can actually join the meeting, they will be waiting, and you will be alerted that there is someone waiting, and you can then let them into the meeting one at a time. So those are the settings pretty much for the personal meeting room that I would suggest you use. And then upcoming meetings, I'm going to go back to the meetings area, and we're going to talk about how to schedule a new meeting. But before we do that, I'm going to go to my default settings for meetings. This is where you would have both the basic and advanced meeting settings, and this is where all the power is in making your rooms more secure. So again, I have participants video off. I have, again, the ability to join before the host. I do not use my personal meeting ID for when I create new meetings. That way I have unique meeting IDs for each meeting. I do use my personal meeting ID for instant meetings, and that way those people that I meet with frequently know what that meeting ID is. You could turn on only authenticated users can join meetings, but what that does is it requires people to log into Zoom, and they do need to be in your domain. One of the challenges with that is that your students may not have the same domain. Their domain for their email is different than the domain for faculty and staff, so I leave that off. You can require a password when scheduling new meetings. They are generated automatically. And then you can also do that for any of your meetings, instant meetings, personal meetings. You can embed that password in the meeting link, so when you send that invitation out, the password is in the meeting link. I think in some ways this defeats the purpose of a password, so you might turn that off if you want to use the password. Then you can send out the link separately from the password, which is kind of a two-factor authentication process. Muting participants upon entry, I mentioned that before. And then down here we have chat. I think chat is a good thing to leave on, but I turn the private chat off. That way there's not other discussion going on. It kind of keeps everyone focused on what's going on in the meeting. You can leave that on if you want for people to be able to have private conversations during the meeting as well. Now, I turned off file transfer, which by default I believe is left on, and I did this because it is possible for someone who wants to send a malicious file into the chat room. That's where you would share it, and they would upload it in there, and then people in the meeting might click on that and download something, malware or something along those lines, to their computer. So I turned that off, and I recommend instead using something like Google Drive and sharing that with your students, and that way you can manage those files, or you can just put the files into Blackboard. I have allow host to put attendee on hold, and that basically, if someone is being disruptive in your class, and this could be very well be a student, you can put them on hold, and they cannot really interact with the meeting until you release them from hold. So that's a feature, not necessarily for someone hacking into your class, but someone that maybe is in the class but is being disruptive. I think one of the strongest things that you can do to secure your meetings is to use is who can share and screen sharing, and I would suggest that host only is the most restrictive and probably the best solution. If you do have people who enter your meeting that do not belong there, usually what they're trying to do is share their screens, and so you're preventing them from being able to do that. Once you're in the meeting, and I'll show you some screenshots in a minute, you can actually provide people with permission to make those or to share. I don't recommend turning off or preventing people from sharing their desktop. If someone needs to share, I would prefer to be able to share desktop as well as applications. There is a whiteboard and there is annotation in that. That can also be somewhat disruptive, but as long as you're deciding who gets to share, then these can be used responsibly. Remote control. This, if you don't think you'll be using this, you might turn remote control off. What that does is it prevents people from getting permission to manage your computer, or providing permission for you to manage someone else's computer. By turning that off, then you're making it somewhat more secure, and probably there are a few occasions where you want to be able to have remote control, unless you're providing direct support in the use of technology. I also have it where people who are removed from the meeting are permitted to rejoin. They are not. So sometimes you can boot someone, they can come back in, but if you leave this on this off setting, then they cannot rejoin. Virtual background I have turned off. This is one of the things that we've seen with the Zoom bombing, is that people have offensive backgrounds, and so if you turn that off, they won't be sharing those. And finally, the last thing I would make sure is that you have this option of having the waiting room again. If you want to let everyone in individually, you can have them in the waiting room, and then you can give them permission to join. This way, no one joins your meeting that doesn't belong there. But there are a couple of other ways to do that, and I'll demonstrate that as well. So as you make these changes in your settings, they're saved automatically. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to meetings, and we're going to create a new meeting. So you might be using this for your class, and then you might say, well, this is going to be a recurring meeting, and we're going to be meeting weekly, and we're going to be meeting on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and 2 p.m. is fine. And then for however many weeks, we might say, so we've got, maybe we've got 4 more weeks. So we can set that up so that now that is something that people can put on their calendar. It's something you can send out. There's an invitation to the meeting, and you have one each time. I had set up automatically to create a password, but I'm going to, instead of that, I'm going to say registration is required. And that means that your students have to register, or all participants in this have to register first. And then they can attend any of the occurrences once they've registered. So naturally, you can prevent others from registering as long as you can look at who all is registered for the event. The other thing that I would recommend is that you record the meeting automatically down here. And that has nothing to do with security other than you are able to record the meeting, and if you're the instructor, it starts to record when you join, and it also stops recording when you end the meeting. So there's my meeting. And I did set up a password apparently for people to join. If I want to edit this meeting, I can come down here. I'm going to turn that off because I have said that I want people to register. Okay, so there's the new meeting ID. They're able to, this is the information, here's the invitation, because it is that you do need to register before joining the meeting. This is the way to get to the registration, and then they get an email saying that they can enter the meeting.